Extending an invitation. Democrats offer President Donald Trump the chance to testify in the impeachment investigation. How the White House is responding. Hitting the road. Pope Francis heads to Thailand and Japan this week. We preview his trip. Battling for control. Police and protesters continue their clashes in Hong Kong. We have reaction from the former British territory. And World Day of the Poor. Why the Holy Father calls the disadvantaged the treasure of the church. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, November 18, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. The House impeachment hearings are entering a crucial second week as Democrats are set to hear from 8 additional witnesses about President Donald Trump's dealings with Ukraine, including perhaps the most anticipated witness, Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us to preview the busy week ahead. Jason?
Wyatt, this impeachment investigation surrounds that question. Did President Trump withhold aid to Ukraine in order to force that country to investigate his political rivals? And Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador, is a key witness in that probe. Several witnesses here in the investigation say he did talk to Ukrainian officials and said if they wanted to meet with President Trump, they'd have to launch that investigation.
We will send that charlatan in the White House back to the golden throne he came from.
Democrat Adam Schiff says they'll oust the president by elections. He's still leading the House's impeachment investigation.
Since I've gotten to Congress, this was one of the worst, most unsuccessful fishing expeditions that I have witnessed.
Republicans say it's not catching much.
I think, frankly, things are going well for the president. They've had 3 hearings, 3 witnesses with no firsthand knowledge. The facts, I say this all the time, but that's the thing about facts, they don't change.
One thing that will change, a witness who had direct talks with President Trump on Ukraine. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland testifies in public Wednesday.
Mr. Sondland has to decide whether his primary loyalty is to America or whether his primary loyalty is to the President of the United States, because it seems clear that he was, in fact, talking pretty regularly, potentially, with the President directly. And if that was the case, then he needs to explain that.
First up tomorrow, an aide to Vice President Mike Pence. Jennifer Williams said the call at the center of this impeachment probe was unusual and inappropriate. President Trump tweets, "Tell Jennifer Williams, whoever that is, to read both transcripts of the presidential calls and see the just released statement from Ukraine. Then she should meet with the other never-Trumpers, who I don't know and mostly never heard of, and work out a better presidential attack."
The spokesman for Vice President Pence says Jennifer Williams does not work for the vice president. Instead, she advises Pence's national security advisor, General Kellogg. Williams will be right here on Capitol Hill tomorrow testifying, along with the former special envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker. Wyatt?
And you'll be there following all of it. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. The big question now, will President Trump testify in his own defense? The top Democrat, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, is encouraging him to share his version of events. Correspondent Mark Irons reports from the White House. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Speaker Nancy Pelosi is challenging the president to come before lawmakers either in person or through a written statement. And we learned today he just might do it.
Good morning, everyone.
Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi invites President Trump to testify in the impeachment investigation. She told CBS the president could come right before the committee and talk, speak all the truth that he wants. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer also dares the president to come forward.
If Donald Trump doesn't agree with what he's hearing, doesn't like what he's hearing, he shouldn't tweet. He should come to the committee and testify under oath, and he should allow all those around him to come to the committee and testify under oath.
The president responded on Twitter, "Even though I did nothing wrong and don't like giving credibility to this no due process hoax, I like the idea and will, in order to get Congress focused again, strongly consider it."
Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth?
President Trump also faces more backlash for his tweets on Friday during Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch's testimony. Democrats described it as witness intimidation.
What effect do you think that has on other witnesses' willingness to come forward?
It's very intimidating.
Pelosi adds, "I just think that was totally wrong and inappropriate and typical of the president."
Without upsetting you too much.
But Republicans defend the president.
It's certainly not impeachable, and it's certainly not criminal, and it's certainly not witness intimidation. It certainly wasn't trying to prevent her, or would it have prevented her from testifying? She was actually in the process of testifying.
An inquiry is an inquiry.
Today on Twitter, President Trump took a swing at the speaker, calling her crazy, do-nothing, nervous Nancy Pelosi. He blames her and the other Democrats for the country's stalemate on drug pricing, infrastructure, and the United States-Mexico-Canada trade deal. President Trump writes, "The rules are rigged by Pelosi and Schiff, but we are winning, and we will win."
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she has no idea when the impeachment inquiry may wrap up. Some Republican analysts believe Democrats are just trying to drag out the process to try to hurt the president's re-election chances. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Russia has returned 3 naval ships seized from Ukraine. The Russian Coast Guard took 2 gunboats and a tugboat last year. Moscow says the vessels violated procedures while they were traveling through an area between Russia and Crimea. 24 Ukrainian sailors were also detained. They were returned in September as part of a prisoner exchange. North Korea cast doubt on whether there will be another nuclear summit with President Donald Trump. The president had hinted he might soon meet with Kim Jong-un. Pyongyang responded saying it does not want another summit unless it receives something substantial from the United States in return. North Korea has set an end-of-the-year deadline for the United States to come up with a deal to salvage nuclear diplomacy. A government official in Iran says protests in his country are expected to end this week. Nationwide unrest began over a rise in gasoline prices. Iranian television showed images over the weekend of damage left by demonstrators. The government responded by shutting down the internet across the nation of 80 million people. A spokesman says all but a couple of the issues have been resolved, but the protesters are still speaking out against the government. They've put pressure on Iran's top officials as the country struggles economically due to global sanctions. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing new questions over his relationship with an American businesswoman. She allegedly received favors and public funds while Johnson was mayor of London from 2008 to 2016. Johnson denies doing anything improper. He's campaigning ahead of the UK's elections next month, drumming up support for his attempt to pass a Brexit deal with the European Union. Also in the European Union, officials are calling for the closure of a tent camp for migrants in Bosnia. Hundreds of refugees are living in poor conditions with almost no facilities. One EU representative calls the camp shocking. She says it does not provide even basic services. The BBC reports there are disagreements among French authorities over the rebuilding project at Notre Dame Cathedral. Specifically, there are arguments over whether the church's iconic spire should look modern or medieval. The roof of the 850-year-old cathedral caught fire last April. A final decision on the spire is not expected until 2021. The president of Cyprus says Pope Francis has accepted an invitation to visit the country next year. 2020 marks the 60th anniversary of the Mediterranean island nation's independence from British colonial rule. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI visited Cyprus. The country is about 90% Orthodox and roughly 3% Catholic. Pope Francis leaves tomorrow for his 7-day trip to Japan and Thailand.
ในสิ่งที่ไม่ดีแต่เป็นบทสอนทำให้เราสามารถที่จะมองข้ามว่าต่อไปนี้
A priest from a small village in northeast Thailand says the Holy Father's visit is an opportunity to bring all Thais together. This village is one of the most important Catholic sites in the country. 7 martyrs died during the Franco-Thai War in 1940. Although Pope Francis will not visit the shrine, residents are looking forward to the first papal visit in 35 years. Hannah Brockhaus, senior Rome correspondent for Catholic News Agency, will be on the papal flight and joins us now from Rome. Hannah, what's on the Pope's agenda this week?
Well, Wyatt, when the Pope visits Thailand and Japan, one of the main themes of his trip will be to meet the small Catholic population in both of these countries. There is less than 0.5% of Catholics in both Thailand and Japan. And part of what the Pope will do on this trip is to celebrate public masses almost every day. As well, an important moment in Japan will take place when he visits a memorial to Japanese martyrs in Nagasaki. in Japan, for hundreds of years, Catholics were severely persecuted, so that should be an emotional moment.
And I want to go back and ask you about that in Japan, but first, let's start with that first stop, which is going to be Thailand. What will be the Pope's main message in Thailand to the people there?
It's expected that mainly he's going to speak about interreligious issues, especially since there's a large diversity of religions there, mainly Buddhism and Hinduism. And so he'll have one meeting with the Supreme Patriarch of Buddhism. He'll have another with 18 different religious leaders, including Christian and other religions. And that will be in another important meeting.
Okay, so while in Japan, the second stop, the Holy Father, as you mentioned, will visit World War II ground zeros of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Why is the stop so important for the Pope?
Well, as many people probably know, Pope Francis has been very vocal throughout his pontificate about the need for nuclear disarmament. He knows that maybe that isn't totally reasonable to expect total disarmament, but yet he prays for that. And even today, in a message he sent to Japan ahead of his trip, he called nuclear arms and weapons, he called them immoral. So we're expecting that he's going to speak about that, especially at these two ground zeros in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that he's going to promote peace and speak about the need of that as well.
Hannah, I understand this will be your second papal flight. Tell us a little bit about it for people who are unfamiliar with what it's like to be on the plane with Pope Francis.
Yeah, well, it's of course really exciting to have this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to it. What this means is that I'll be on the same flight with Pope Francis, and the rest of the Vatican press corps will be following the Pope around at each of his events in both countries. We'll get to follow his speeches, as well as just be on the ground and present at those events, get to take those in. I'll be writing about his speeches as well. And then an important moment is on the return flight back to Rome from Tokyo, where the Pope will give an in-flight press conference. So the journalists on the plane will follow that closely. We'll get to ask a few questions of the Holy Father, and then as well we'll be reporting on that for all of our viewers.
Very good, and obviously we'll be paying attention to all of your reports. Hannah Brockhaus, Senior Rome Correspondent for Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Coming up, an update on the violent clashes between police and anti-government protesters in Hong Kong. Anti-government demonstrations grow increasingly more violent in Hong Kong. Clashes continue today between protesters and riot police outside a university. Police fired rounds of pepper balls and used tear gas to subdue protesters. Demonstrators were trying to escape from the campus of Hong Kong Polytechnic University to avoid arrest after barricading themselves inside the campus last week. Hong Kong has been rocked by anti-government protests for nearly 6 months. Joining me now by Skype from Hong Kong is Wilson Leung, a member of the Progressive Lawyers Group, a pro-democracy organization which advocates for human rights. Wilson, welcome back to the program. What are conditions like there in Hong Kong as we watch this tense standoff between police and demonstrators play out on the university campus?
Well, we're seeing astonishing scenes of really a pitched battle. On the one hand, at the university itself, we see almost a military-style assault by the police against the university students who are barricading themselves inside. So we see the police with their, their weapons, their tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannon, and then the defenders inside with their petrol bombs and so on. But at the same time, we've got many other protesters who are trying to come in from the surrounding areas in order to try to distract the police. And so we're seeing also lots of clashes in various areas of the territory around the university as well. So you've got a lot of clashes, a lot of fire, a lot of shots being fired this evening.
Can only imagine how scary it is to be there. There's another concern that we've been following. There's some concerns that were heightened over the weekend when soldiers from China's People's Liberation Army were spotted leaving their barracks unarmed and wearing civilian clothing to clean up debris on the streets. What does that signal to you? What do you think that's all about?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an alarming sight. Although their action itself appears harmless, it's actually of quite big constitutional significance. Because under Hong Kong's mini constitution, it's quite arguable that the Chinese army is not supposed to intervene in local affairs. And in fact, they're not even supposed to participate in maintenance of public order or disaster relief unless requested to do so by the local Hong Kong government. And the local Hong Kong government have confirmed that they did not request any of this assistance. So it very much appears to be a very obvious and demonstrative sign that the PLA is here, is in town, and a worrying sign that they might be about to or willing to do further public appearances on the streets of Hong Kong, doing more than just clean up.
And if all of this wasn't bad enough, all of its unfolding as Hong Kong's High Court on Monday struck down a ban on wearing face masks in public. How much of a blow is this to government leaders who wanted to ban face masks?
It's certainly a slap in the face because the government was heavily criticized when it used a law from 1922, basically which allowed her to do anything she wanted if she said it was an emergency. And she elected to use that power in order to ban face masks. And it was heavily criticized for its constitutionality. Right now, we saw the High Court striking down that law, agreeing with it. But for sure, the government is going to bring an appeal. And there's two more stages of appeal. And we've seen in recent years, the pattern that they have is that they throw unlimited resources into these legal battles. You can be sure that they're going to challenge it to the highest court.
We're also keeping our eye on elections this upcoming Sunday for Hong Kong as well. Wilson Leung of the Progressive Lawyers Group, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Up next, how Pope Francis celebrated World Day of the Poor. Venerable Fulton Sheen will be beatified next month. The Diocese of Peoria, Illinois announced today that the Vatican called for beatification on December 21st, 2019. The ceremony will take place at the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception in Peoria. It's the same cathedral where Sheen was ordained a priest 100 years ago. The cathedral is also resting place for Archbishop Sheen. John Bel Edwards, a pro-life Democrat, wins re-election as Louisiana's governor.
You may have heard me say once or twice that God will order our steps, but we have to move our feet. And you moved your feet to the polls.
Edwards focused primarily on bipartisan state issues during the campaign. He won about 51% of the vote. Republicans had hoped to reclaim the seat on the strength of President Trump's popularity in the state. This fall, Republicans also lost the governor's race in Kentucky and legislative races in Virginia. Defense attorneys for pro-life advocate David Daleiden say they will appeal a multi-million-dollar judgment against him. On Friday, a federal jury ruled against Daleiden after he secretly recorded workers at Planned Parenthood clinics. The court found him liable for violating federal and state laws. The San Francisco jury said Daleiden trespassed on private property and committed other crimes in recording the undercover videos in 2015 of workers allegedly discussing the sale of baby body parts. Daleiden, the Center for Medical Progress, and other parties could be ordered to pay as much as $2.3 million in damages. Joining me now by Skype from Lombard, Illinois, is Peter Breen, Vice President and Senior Counsel for the Thomas More Society, a pro-life law firm defending David Daleiden in this suit. Peter, welcome back to the broadcast. David Daleiden's organization, the Center for Medical Progress, issued a statement saying justice was not done. As someone who was in the courtroom, what are your impressions of the proceedings?
Well, and justice was not done. I sat next to David as one of his lawyers for the last 7 weeks as we watched this jury trial unfold, and we had a judge that went against all sorts of established case precedent he turned the First Amendment on its head and really gave these jurors instructions that were not in accord with the law, along with preventing us from putting on our case. And so we are, very much justice was not done, and we are looking forward to going on appeal with this to try to get some relief under what we would say are clearly established case precedents.
You said this lawsuit brought by Planned Parenthood is, quote, payback. What did you mean by that?
Well, and you saw it in court. The judge excluded any evidence that Planned Parenthood had been selling baby body parts, which David and his team, they got a lot of that evidence, hundreds of hours of it. But instead, they came into court with this narrative that somehow they wanted to drive this narrative of violent pro-lifers. And it was just this terrible, terrible thing. No foundation in the facts, but they were able to drive that narrative. And that's what they were allowed to do by the court. And so that was the whole point. David gave them a black eye. Frankly, David and his band of investigators took this multi-billion-dollar corporation and brought it to its knees. And so this was payback.
Well, what do you think are the broader implications of this case, noting how the ruling was?
Well, two major implications. Number one, if this stands, you are going to see the end of citizen investigation of dirty abortion practices, both Planned Parenthoods and all the rest of them. But number two, more broadly for the whole of society, you are going to see undercover journalism suppressed, diminished, chilled. And that is bad for all of us, no matter what issue you care about. Undercover journalism brings you information you need in order to make decisions as we the people, hold your government accountable, and decide on how to rule ourselves.
And just to remind our audience, there is an ongoing California state criminal trial over these same videos, and attorneys from the Thomas More Society continue to defend Daleiden in that case too. Are you hopeful for a different result in criminal court?
Well, we have had a much better time there. The judge has allowed our evidence that defends David and his team. So we felt good about that case. I will say this, though. It was brought by the Attorney General. It was the first time they'd ever applied that law to a journalist. And there are plenty of other journalists in California operating that are not being prosecuted. But with this jury verdict, I fear that the Attorney General's office is going to be emboldened. You could see negative implications because we've got a San Francisco jury, and that's a tough place for a pro-life case. So I very much, I think the other side is going to be emboldened. So we're going to have to fight very, very hard to keep David and Sandra Susan Merritt, his co-defendant, out of jail. That's 10 years in San Quentin is at stake there for doing the same thing that every other undercover journalist does, just going undercover and allowing people to talk to you.
In April, the Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal seeking to dismiss a lawsuit against Daleiden and the Center for Medical Progress on grounds of the First Amendment freedoms. This goes back to your earlier thought about the precedent the civil suit has a result. Do you think things could change in the future?
Absolutely. So the Supreme Court doesn't like to take cases that aren't final. So now we're final. And I'll tell you, we've got a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals where President Trump has named more judges to the Ninth Circuit than any other president. People don't necessarily know that. So we could have a receptive Court of Appeals to our First Amendment arguments. And you're looking at judges that are going to be a little more even-handed, possibly, than maybe you would have seen even 4 years ago.
All right. Well, this is such an important case for us and our viewers, and obviously we'll keep our eye on it and continue to get updates. Peter Breen, Vice President and Senior Counsel for the Thomas More Society, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Pope Francis says the greed of a few adds to the poverty of many.
L'indifferenza della società verso I poveri.
On World Day of the Poor Sunday at the Vatican, the Holy Father called the disadvantaged the treasure of the Church. He also says they show us the face of Christ and tells all Christians they should live as if they are beggars reaching out to God. The Holy Father also addressed the plight of disadvantaged last Friday. He opened a new home for the poor and homeless just yards away from St. Peter's Square. The house has room for 50 people to sleep. It also will provide more than 200 meals each day. During his visit, the Holy Father visited the chapel dedicated to St. George. He also met with volunteers. It's one of several homes for the poor in the vicinity of the Vatican. Always good to see the Church helping those most in need. And with that, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.